Hello everyone and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin as always, and I know this show is just starting to turn into what excuse do you have this time show, but I have a good excuse, okay? I got COVID and it really just kind of wiped me out for a bit, and thankfully I was able to take the time I needed to really rest and recover, and so I started working on this episode, and I'm really excited because this one was actually a lot of fun, and I took a class on this particular subject when I was in school back in 2018 or something. It was one of my undergrad courses, and it was so fascinating, and it really helped to change the way that I viewed old Hollywood movies. And now that I've given you this little spiel as I sip on some hibiscus tea, I'm going to talk to you guys about the Hollywood Code. So in order to get into the history of the Hollywood Code, we need to first cover the history of Hollywood itself, as well as basically the beginning of film history. Now, for this particular subject, because the code applies to film in America, I'm particularly going to focus on American cinema for this because it's its own can of worms, really, but there are also a lot of fascinating histories behind film in Europe. So perhaps one day I'll get into something like that on another episode, but in the meantime, we're going to dig into some American film history. So at its core, if we go into what movies are based on a succession of images, and we've had this fascination since the dawn of humanity with images that move one after another. We've liked to portray images with an implication of motion. If you think about cave drawings, we have this sort of successive look to it. Think about little flip pages where a drawing will move as the pages turn, or think of phenakistocopes, something kind of like that. These all create the illusion of motion, and as we continue through time, the illusion of motion becomes more and more advanced. So we start off with these very primitive implications of motion like cave drawings from the early history of man to 1659, when we have the Dutchman Christian Huygens creating a show via lanterns that have shapes cut into them and moving pieces of glass that are illuminated by candles. And this form of entertainment carried on because it fascinated people so much, and it reached its peak in the 19th century with what was known as phantasmagoria, which was in a way sort of a horror theater using this magic lantern technique, as it was called, to create very frightening images. So this art form goes from being very simple and available on a small scale with the original invention in 1659 of the magic lantern to this large scale phantasmagoria where thousands or hundreds of people can witness it. So when it comes to the 19th century, when it comes to the succession of motion, we've succeeded in developing entertainment via projection. The only issue is this doesn't quite help us in the aspect of movies as we know it today, because we're still missing a photographic element. So up next on the scene, we have Edward Muybridge, who in 1878 decided to settle a bet. He wanted to prove that when horses run, there's a point where none of the hooves touch the ground. And he wins this bet by threading a camera to take a series of photos and then playing them one after the other to show the movement. So we finally achieve movement in photographs, but because it has to be done to take every particular shot one at a time, it's just not the most practical way. It's kind of like the flip book we have, but with a camera. So we're starting to make some progress, but it's still nowhere near the scope of movies as we know it today. Then next we have Etienne Maree, who comes along in the late 19th century, and he uses something of a photo gun, for lack of a better term, to capture movement of something. He would usually film an animal like a bird taking flight to help illustrate this movement. However, he doesn't get the photos into actual motion. Again, we're still stuck in this method of implied motion. And then along comes Thomas Edison, and we'll put a fat asterisk there because he was notorious for stealing, but Edison is basically credited for the idea of putting photos to motion by modeling the visual aspect kind of in the style of the phonograph and how it projected sound. He was able to sort of use a similar idea but apply it to vision. Then enter Auguste and Louis Lumière in 1895, and they improve on Edison's idea by combining Edison's kinetoscope with the magic lantern. And they managed to create this incredible feat by filming factory workers leaving their jobs for the day. And we see other examples of primitive films, such as trains that run over the tracks and footage of the Paris's Guard Cafe. And with the premiere of these films on December 28th of 1895, we have what is considered the birthday of movies. Now, if you go back to, there are a lot of films that can be debated to have been the original film. There's some of a man sneezing. There's another of a couple kissing, which was actually considered very scandalous for the time. But in essence, we have movies as a form itself and a baseline for what film will become. And now that there's a strategy to capture film, people aren't really sure what to do with it. Some people view filming as a lower class gimmick, and they don't really consider it having staying power. Why would you want to see a recording of something when you can go see somebody live in a theater? But some people think it could be used for other purposes aside from entertainment. It could be used for documentation, education, spreading news, or propaganda. It could be used for all sorts of reasons. One of the pioneers of using movies for storytelling was George Méliès, and he is therefore able to use this medium to create an identity for film as an art form and as entertainment. He has this unique background in magic tricks that allow him to develop some different illusions and tricks for the camera, and his stories would tend to revolve around fantasy or something along a sci-fi theme, and he is able to sort of create these larger-than-life ideas and stories. And then we have filmmakers that follow afterwards, like Edwin Porter and D.W. Griffith, that master the basics of using artistic cuts and angles and varying the lengths of movies to eventually go from these short little clips and miniature stories that you see to long film-length performances that are like a theater performance. Now, from here, let's get into the history of Hollywood itself. So Hollywood itself is considered to have been founded when Dada Wilcox settled in Southern California, and she named it Hollywood. And she and her husband purchased a large amount of land in this area. And afterwards, there was a real estate boom throughout California in the 1870s to the 1880s. And it would keep growing as a city throughout the 20th century. For instance, in 1920, the population was about 36,000 people, but by 1930, it went up to 157,000 people. So that's Hollywood as a place. But Hollywood is also a concept as well as an industry. And why would it become the film industry in particular? Well, there are three main reasons for this. The first one is quite simple, and that has to do with the weather. So the film stock at the time was relatively primitive, especially compared to what we know now. And the film stock would need a great deal of sunlight exposure. And California had plenty to offer because the weather tends to be very consistent too. The good weather is also helpful for when it comes to filming year-round as well. It can be hard to film when the weather conditions aren't great, but when they're stable consistently, it's a good place to be. Second, the locations were very convenient. So being so close to Los Angeles, there are a variety of terrains that can provide a great backdrop for filming any sorts of movies with stories set in different locations. You can pretend to be all over the world in a pretty small radius of land. The land also tended to be pretty affordable, so that was another great bonus. And third, we have what is known as the trust. So when Edison was delving into the film industry, Edison developed the trust, or the Edison Trust, or the Motion Picture Patents Company. And he did this to basically develop a monopoly on movie making. And due to Edison's location in New Jersey, and a lot of filmmakers at the time originally being located on the East Coast of the United States, Edison was in the perfect spot to send his thugs after competitors. And eventually people started to leave the East Coast. And California was a great choice, not only because it was on the complete opposite side of the country, but it had a close proximity to Mexico just in case Edison's agents did actually go out that far. So once Hollywood began to develop its roots in California, we start to see growth of the industry through two major factors. So we have what is known as the studio system, and then we have the movie star system. So first we have the studio system, and a lot of names from these studios that were in place might actually still be recognizable today. The seven big ones were Paramount, MGM or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Fox Studios, Warner Brothers, Universal, Columbia, and RKO. And then there was an eighth group that was called United Artists, but that one's just a bit different from the standard studio definition because it was a group of actors rather than a studio. So that one isn't always considered one of the main seven. So the way the studio system worked was that it was a self-contained system that was a completely internal process, from writing to shooting to editing. All the sets and the stages were internal, and all the roles were were internal as well, and this included the actors as well. So actors that were signed into contracts with certain studios could only work for that particular studio. And these studios cranked out movies constantly, like an assembly line. They were making new films all the time. There's actually a really interesting story that the actress who played Melanie in Gone with the Wind, she had actually been employed by a different studio at the time that Gone with the Wind was starting to be cast. And there was this huge drama over her auditioning to be in this movie. She eventually got the clearance for it, but she had snuck over to audition for this. Thankfully, it managed to work out, but had it not worked out, and even though it actually, and even though she eventually did end up being in the film and all was well, she was in violation of her contract, and had the story not been as happy ending as it truly was, she could have potentially jeopardized her entire career in Hollywood. So that should give you an idea of just how strict this studio system was. So aside from the studio system, we also have the star system, and it's sort of the foundation for celebrity publicity that we see today, although it definitely started off on a much smaller scale. So Carl Laemmle was credited with creating the star system by hiring a girl named Florence Lawrence and basically advertising gossip about her and her life. And when people would become interested and learn about her, they would pay to go see the films, because in a way, it's a bit like going to see a friend. You kind of recognize them and you're excited to see their work and how it turns out. Some of the first stars that we see that really start to gain publicity are Maree Pickford, who is kind of the girl next door, fun character with a bunch of spunk that people could relate to. You have Theda Bara, who is considered this sex icon. People go to see her because she's this very attractive woman and they want to go admire her. And then we have the likes of Rudolph Valentino, who's a bit like Theda Bara, but the male version. We have Tom Mix, Douglas Fairbanks, and more. And in a lot of cases, these personas that the actors and actresses would have to play would often be kind of amped up because they had to feed the public these entertaining stories. So just because they had a persona that was advertised to the public, it didn't always mean that that's what they were like. However, the system would kind of backfire a bit when some of the stars would start to receive negative press. This included an affair that Maree Pickford had with a man who also worked in Hollywood named Fairbanks. There was the Arbuckle trial. There was the murder of William Desmond Taylor. There were actor overdoses. There were Charlie Chaplin and his child brides. A lot of people started to look on Hollywood with kind of a distasteful view. The people that were working in the studios were really concerned that they would lose their audiences because people wouldn't want to support such vulgar lifestyles. Hollywood was starting to become associated with scandal and vice, so the film industry responded to this with what is known as the Haze Code. Now, before the Haze Code was fully fledged, its roots began in 1927, but rather than being a strict set of rules for content of what could be shown on the silver screen, they were more like suggestions. They called them the don'ts and be carefuls. And in some ways, this was considered the Hollywood Magna Carta. The list of rules I found was about 36 items long or so I'll just read off some of the things that couldn't be shown in a film so you get an idea. All right, so we have profanity, illegal traffic of drugs, white slavery, ridicule of the clergy, arson, sympathy towards criminals, sex hygiene, or just sex in general, the institution of marriage, which is interesting because later when we have more developments of the code, marriage has to be upheld. So I don't know, it's confusing. And then, of course, you have drugs, quote, heavy kisses, which were basically kisses that lasted more than 3 seconds. And then, of course, sedition, because, politics. And there are plenty more. If you'd like a full list, you can search that up. I just don't want to bog you all down with this massive description. But anyway, the Haze Code was named after William Harrison Hayes, who was the chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. And funny enough, when I was researching him, it turns out that Hayes was actually responsible for helping put together the presidential campaign of Warren G. Harding. And then Harding appointed him as the Postmaster General. So he actually had quite the political career before getting involved in cinema. So Hayes, in his high-ranking positions, sets out to keep people from banning films outright. They're worried at this point with the disrepute that Hollywood is going through that films will be banned or censored directly by the government. And of course, too, if films are being viewed unfavorably, then budgets of the studios might end up being reduced. So Hayes established this set of guidelines to encourage them to release movies that would be less likely to be banned. So rather than having governmental or federal censorship, the studios would be self-censoring in order to maintain their funding. And what was interesting was that the person who developed this set of codes that inspired Hayes was a Catholic man named Father Daniel A. Lord. And he presented this list to Hayes in 1930, and Hayes was like, yes, bingo, this is exactly what I need. And in essence, this list was very similar to the Be Carefuls list. And there was a statement at the beginning that read these 3 points. 1. No picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. 2. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. 3. Law, natural or human, shall be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. However, in spite of all these guidelines, the Haze office didn't have the authority to remove parts from a film. They would instead try to reason with filmmakers, and in some cases even beg them to follow the restrictions. But at this point, the studios still have the power to decide, and with the rise of the Great Depression from 1929 onwards, the studios were increasingly desperate to sell tickets and make money, and they were like, hey, sex and violence sells, so we should keep making it that way. So people started to view the code as something of a joke. However, in 1934, the code was adjusted and a new group was established called the Production Code Administration, or the PCA. And the PCA, after July 1st, 1934, would require all films to obtain a certificate of approval before they could be released to audiences. The very first film to receive this appeal was a movie called The World Moves On, which was a romantic drama directed by John Ford. Again, this was put into place because they wanted to avoid the government having to get involved with film censorship. And the need for censorship had been increasing since films were becoming more and more in partnership with sound. When films with sound became the norm, Father Lord, who wrote the Haze Code, said, "Silent smut has been bad, vocal smut cried to the censors for vengeance." And now we have a new character that enters the scene. So Joseph I. Breen was the one that was eventually appointed to the head of the PCA, and he enforced this Haze Code certification. So one thing that's interesting is that we see films being morphed to fit these codes. For instance, in the film Rebecca, they changed the plot from the original novel, where Maxim de Winters kills his wife, and instead they make it an accident because the code states that somebody who committed a crime shouldn't get to live happily ever after afterwards. Another famous incident with the code is obviously from the movie Gone with the Wind. There's the famous line where Rhett Butler, as he's about to leave Scarlett, says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." And the line was almost changed to, "Frankly, my dear, I just don't care." And I think we can all agree it just doesn't feel the same. The drama is just like gone. And so the producer, David O. Selznick, decided to just keep the line in anyway, and for those that violated the code, they would have to pay a fine. And Selznick paid about $5,000 for this, which is actually a huge sum for this time. It's about $50,000 in today's money. And another thing that's interesting is that the code would sometimes include political censorship. For instance, the Warner Brothers wanted to make a film about the concentration camps in Nazi-occupied territories, but the code forbade portraying other countries in a negative light, which is ridiculous because Charlie Chaplin has a whole satire film impersonating Hitler, so it makes sense. However, there were some movements and events throughout the 1950s that started to lead to the decline of the studio system in Hollywood, and in a way to the decline of old Hollywood itself. The code kind of began to fizzle in the late 40s, and the PCA decided to double down on it in 1951 and make it even more strict by adding more words and scenarios that weren't allowed. However, the Hollywood industry was facing a decline for a variety of reasons. First, television was gradually becoming more popular and widespread, and people wouldn't have to leave the comfort of their own homes for entertainment. But at first this threat wasn't really taken seriously because films did have the edge over television for a while. Because films were in color while TVs were still in black and white, screens at a theater were obviously much bigger and the sound was better, and famous actors were more inclined to act in movies rather than TV shows. There were also some political complications due to the rise of the Red Scare throughout the United States, and several actors and people in the film industry were blacklisted due to the outreach of several anti-communist movements. People were accusing each other of being associated with the Reds, and this in turn would impact their careers. This went on from the late 40s to the 50s, and further contributed to the downfall of the strict studio system that had previously thrived in Hollywood. There's also a series of retirements of major Hollywood moguls, such as studio owners, directors, and actors that, in a way, embodied the old golden age of Hollywood films. There were also retirements of people working in the systems that managed all these studios. This included Breen, who was the head of the PCA until he retired in 1954. And increasingly popular movies were making their way to the box office without getting seals of approval, such as Some Like It Hot, The Man with the Golden Arm, and The Anatomy of a Murder. So all these films are making it big without the Hollywood Code's approval. And if all these films are able to sneak by and still be successful, then the impact of the code is eventually starting to lessen, and it would eventually be replaced altogether by the MPAA, MPAA system, or the Motion Picture Association of America, in 1968. The president of the MPAA, Jack Valenti, would replace the code with a voluntary set of film ratings that would inform audiences basically about what they could expect from the film, and also work as a preventative guard against government censorship. With this new system, Valenti hoped to be able to protect young viewers by preventing them from seeing things that they shouldn't, while also allowing artists of the film genre to create their work and be protected by the rating system and tell a variety of stories. Originally, the ratings went from G, PG, R, and X until 1984, when the PG-13 rating was added, and in 1990 when the NC-17 rating was added. So this new system led the way for a new Hollywood. New genres began to take root, such as the slasher genre, blaxploitation, action, teen movies, science fiction, and pornography, as well as films that tended to be less family-friendly and more open-ended in their meanings and interpretations. And now we're living in an interesting period where, in some ways, film is becoming eclipsed with the rise of streaming and politics that go on behind various films. Films are also very much impacted by the good graces of the actors that are in them. And there are more methods of piracy that also allow people to bypass paying for content altogether. But we also constantly hear about blockbusters that break records at the box office. So the future of Hollywood is still up for debate, and it really is in our hands. And I think it's going to be very fascinating to see how it changes in our own lifetimes. And that is it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, because I just think this is fascinating. And I've really only just scratched the surface of this. You could dig into it so much more with each individual film you find during about 1930 to 1968. And you'll be able to just notice little ways that the code was respected. And I liked having the chance to go back and look on something that I haven't studied for a while. So it brought back some old memories and stuff. And now I really want to go and watch some more of these films that have been on my list for a while. So if you liked this episode, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, follow. Every platform is a little bit different. If you would like to leave me a rating at ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts, that would be fantastic. It really does help to boost the podcast. If you would like to hear more from me, you can check out my Instagram at teatimethoughtspodcast. I also have a YouTube channel at teatimethoughtspodcast Podcast where I upload these episodes. And if you're interested in some more short comedic history content, you can follow my TikTok at teatimethoughts. Don't forget to tune in next time when I talk about Carlos II with a special guest. And in the meantime, if you guys have any ideas or questions that you would like to address, please feel free to send me a message. And again, thank you for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.